Hello and welcome to our underwater tutorial for Waterline Pro. Now in this video we're actually using a Waterline Pro that is not fully released yet. This is our sort of update 5.2, so there might be a couple of things that are different from what you have at the time of the release of this video. But overall we're going to be releasing it in a couple of weeks if things go according to plan. So let's just dive in. We have our default level, and just so we get some wave data, we're gonna run the ocean simulation and then pause it. Now, to start us off, you might see that we have a bit more detail right now, and we're gonna be explaining that when the update gets released. So to start us off, let's see what happens when we go underwater. And let's hide the floor. So immediately we notice that we don't have an underwater surface. Now there are two ways we could do this. If we were to go above the water, there is a underwater surface enable, and what this will do is create a second mesh that is underwater with its own underwater surface material here. Now this generally looks better and gives you more options to fine-tune the underwater visuals, and this is what it looks like. It has a bit more details like chromatic aberration around surface objects, but again, it's a bit more expensive. It's probably better used for movies or for projects that take place mainly underwater. So if we disable that, we also have a more efficient solution that we can enable by opening up our current water surface material like this, and we're gonna type in 2 in the search bar, and we have these two settings that we need to enable. Shaders are gonna recompile, and there we go. Now the difference here is mainly the aberration and a couple of more details in terms of like little textures, bubbles, and stuff like that. So this is pretty much the first stage that you need to decide how are you going to be rendering your underwater surface, or if you'll be rendering it at all. Next up, let's have a look at what these settings give us. So we're just going to type in underwater. This is again our surface material, and we have a couple of settings. So underwater surface light vector offset, we're going to be going over this a little bit later. Underwater normal power, and this kind of dictates the sort of mask that you could see above and below the waves. You could tweak this as needed. .85 is pretty good. This sort of controls how strongly the wave simulation that is above the water gets applied beneath the water. And next up, we have the underwater surface boost, and that is something that if we set, for example, to 0 or 1, that our surface kind of disappears. And with 1, we can kind of see it, but it's a lot dimmer than it's supposed to be. And this value allows us to give it a little bit of a boost. So 10 is pretty good in this scenario, but you can control it to something a bit more blown out, depending on what you're after. Next, underwater refraction ratio is kind of similar to the underwater surface power, but this controls the sort of refraction mask where the water becomes sort of solid blue and where it's transparent. A value of 48.6 is the sort of physically accurate value, but you can tweak this once again as you see fit. Next up, we have refraction underwater strength, and that basically tells us how distorted objects that are above the water appear. For example, this sort of cube right here. So a value of 1 will distort it a lot. Value of 0 again. So again, this is something you could tweak to your liking. And next up, we have underwater surface color, and that kind of gives us the overall tint of our underwater mesh, material here. Generally, we can go with grayscale value because a ton of the colors underwater are handled by our post-processing material. We could go with something bluish, but it's not going to have too much of an effect. We can increase the brightness, and if we go for something like orange, it's not going to make too much of a difference, again, because the red spectrum of the light is kind of the first to get absorbed underwater. But depending on what you need, you could tweak these here. But what if you want more controls? Well, then we need to disable this by again typing the 2 here and disabling both of these. Now, one reason why you might want to have this disabled is if we go above water, we could see that some of our waves are quite sharp and ocean geometry is kind of folding in on itself, and it being two-sided at the moment will produce these white streaks. If we disable this, we could see that the streaks go away, but then we also lose our underwater effects. And if we want to have both, underwater surface enable, we have this, and our waves look great and sharp above water as well. And now let's go over the underwater surface material, and here you have quite a few more things. Now this is a bit more complicated because you have more things to manage, but overall you have the wave crest mask, and this sort of controls things like where color for the crest and color for the pit is going to be applied. For example, let's go with some wackier looking colors here. And now we could see that we've kind of really exaggerated the values and made our water look really contrasty, kind of where the color pit, this, and the sort of white Fresnel effect gets applied. We can control these a bit more to get a nicer looking sort of dark bluish kind of feel for it. But yeah, depending on the shot you're after, this might be something that you'd want to tweak. Next up, we have controls for the roughness. So let's make the pit extra shiny and maybe the crest shinier as well. We have, again, refraction ratio that controls the overall mask, where you could see the outside world, and the refraction, which controls how distorted the outside world is. Next up, we have also specular that you can control, shinier, and reflect things more through our roughness crest and roughness pit values. Next up, we have color, and we have the toggle for using or not using chromatic aberrations, so we could disable it. And there we go. We kind of lose that sort of red and blue fringe that you'd get on the shapes. This costs extra to render, so again, depending on your needs, if it's something that's very important, you can have it or you cannot have it. Next up, we also have the detail tile, which is this sort of texture that's like bubbles and little debris that are all over the ocean. You have the tile, and you can boost their brightness and or sort of get rid of them altogether, depending on, again, what you need. Next up, we have the FFT normal power. So that is the power of the ocean simulation normals. At 1, the normals are basically flat. 1.1, we get slightly more waves, and so on and so forth. We could like really exaggerate the effect if needed. Next up, we have ground truth normals, and these are basically needed if you're going to use ground truth normals above the water. Right now, we don't really need them. Use sim normals. This means that the dynamic water simulation normals will also be used here. If you're not using water simulation at all, you could disable this, and that basically means that if a cube were to fall underwater, it will not be generating these normals here. And this again is the simulation normal power, the simulation normal sharpen. This can kind of make the waves look a little bit sharper if they're looking a bit too blobby, if you are running the dynamic water simulation at a lower resolution. Use large normals and small normals, add additional textures that we could see above the water. Right now they're kind of pretty well masked with the distance, but it's something that you don't really need for underwater because you're not really too far off that you could see the entire texture. In a realistic rendering scenario, usually effects like the overall underwater fog will take over this. But small normals is something that we could use and add in an extra normal texture that's animated, and we could tile it. And ideally you'd want to match this with the settings that you have for your water surface material, and which can also support small normals. Right now we're just going to disable that. Normal tile break, again, this sort of removes the tiling of normals in the distance. It's slightly more expensive. It's not really an expensive operation, but again, underwater you don't really need it, so it's off by default. Next up, when it comes to displacement, the really important thing is to keep these values as pretty much identical to what you have on your water surface material. So right now we're not really going to be messing with these. This sort of can removes the choppiness of our FFT ocean near the camera setting. So it being off means that we do apply this effect, and this is the sort of distance that the effect gets applied on. So make sure that these values are identical to your water surface material here. If you go to displacement. Next up, we have use displacement MIP smoothing. This is one of our newer functions, and it can do our mask here. This might break things a bit because, again, these settings need to be synchronized against with a bunch of other materials. So if we were to look for MIP, we can sort of smooth out the waves a bit, or too much, depending on what you're after. So let's disable this for now. We won't be using it. Simulation displacement distance. Again, these are things that you want to match up with your surface material, and this will basically mean that objects that are creating waves in the distance will not create displacement, which can cause artifacts sometimes. Use displacement breakup is the same as it's actually like a secondary texture, displacement texture that you can have here for panning. You can use this to simulate really large waves or swells if you want on top of the ocean simulation. At the moment, we're not using this, so we will be leaving it as off. And then flatten ocean at distance. This sort of, if needed, in some cases, you can flatten out the ocean far away from the camera so you don't get any motion artifacts. In terms of mesh mask offset is a setting that we could move the secondary underwater mesh up or down, and we could also add in mask it out according to the waves as well. So in case you might be getting some artifacts around here for the waterline where the two don't quite align, you could push this way up high and then just mask it. Now this will add some inaccuracies, so depending on the scenario, like here the waves, you could see that they're kind of offset at the moment. We can return these to 0 and get rid of these. Now we're still seeing some little triangles over here, and that is because of the ratio here. Again, keep this as close as possible to the surface here, which if we go at the moment, ratio is 100, so let's match this to 100, or maybe 100 should be best in this case. This sort of controls the scale of the ocean grid being used. Lower means that the grid is bigger, so you get lower resolution up close, whereas lowering it to something like 30 will give you more details in the background. So again, depending on what you're after, what you're rendering, will give you better details. I think right now 30 works best. Next up, use near camera simulation fix. We don't really need it. This is just something, again, that you need to keep constant between the water's surface material and this. Use FFT displacement will basically mean we don't use or not use ocean displacement here. These are our shore options, which you will need to basically make once again identical to your surface material if you're using the shore settings. You could check out our shore tutorials on how to do this in more detail. Next up, you have some blueprint variables that will be set at runtime, so don't really need to worry about these, and a couple of scalar parameters that sort of dictate the brightness outside. Once again, as in our water surface material, we can boost the brightness or lower it depending on what we need. It is pretty good, and then we could also add in a bit of extra brightness to the ocean surface as well. Next up, we have near plane, and that basically means we'll show you in a minute, but this needs to be identical to the near plane setting in your underwater VFX material. And speaking of which, let's go to that next. So Now that we've kind of seen how we can control our underwater surface material, let's see how we can control the visuals of our underwater surface itself. So selecting our ocean, and we're going to be opening up this sort of the underwater post-process material. So let's open it up, and just so we kind of address this near plane here as quickly as possible, let's go with near plane. So near plane, the distance from the camera at which the sort of cutoff effect is being applied. And you could set this in your project settings, and the default value is 10. So objects that are beyond the sort of 10 near clip plane value will get cut off. And here we need to have the same because this is the value at which the water will get cut off. We could sort of push this back, and you could see that we're sampling the height at camera level, but farther away from it. So unless you're messing with the sort of project settings initially, you won't really need to adjust this. So let's go underwater, and here we have settings for whether or not we're going to use volumetric fog. This will be its own sort of topic later on, so right now we will choose not to. Time of day colors, we have some settings. If we were to enable it right now, we notice that our rays are all of a sudden pointing backwards, straight down. And that is because right now we are looking for information from a directional light actor, which we don't have in this level. So what happens if we don't have this though? How do we control the direction of the rays? Well, we have our own little custom actor here that's called light direction blueprint, and it's used to control a couple of additional waterline VFX. One of this is the sort of additional subsurface scattering that we have going on here. Because this is an HDR background and we don't really have any lighting other than this in our entire level, we do sort of rely on this to add in some extra effects and details. And if we were to go underwater, we could see that it is this little blueprint that is driving our rays. And basically, if we were to have an additional sun or something like that, we would also need to animate this blueprint to also follow the lighting. Basically, if we turn this on, the same thing will happen, but we will need to add a directional light. And now we could see that the colors have changed a bit, and that is because we also have some settings, which you might have seen, that have to do with, time of day. So we have things like sunset color, which we could redden up maybe a little bit, get some really nice sort of colors going on here. These settings are also available for our underwater surface here. So if we match these up, we could get the overall underwater to react to the sunlight as needed. Next up, we have sunset color boost. So again, this sort of controls the temperature of the decay. Boost clamp, so how much we want this to sort of be contributing to our sunlight. For example, we might not want to be getting a full-on yellow sunset underwater. We want to restrict it to sort of the colder bluish kind of hues. And next up, we have the vector offset, which we can control the overall, we can offset the kind of angle of the sun in the shader, which means that we have basically bluer hues for a longer period of time before they turn sort of they decay into the orange and greens and so on and so forth. So these are all sort of artistic controls that you could tweak. So let's get rid of time of day colors now and start using our regular settings. So next up, we have the sunset vector offset. Let's just set that to 0, back to the way it was. And just to avoid potential conflicts, let's delete this so we can get our rays back the way they were. Next up, you have this sort of standard controls for underwater color. Depending on what you're after, you go with deeper blues. some that's a bit more like a murky river or something. Next up, you have saturation that you can control, contrast, again for above and below water. This is a sort of a restricted to the underwater sections. You can kind of make the underwater look a bit scarier and darker. Maybe overdoing it with the contrast can produce these sort of firefly effects, so it's something to keep in mind. Full brightness, we can control the brightness of the underwater. Use shallows means we have some additional underwater effects, so we can disable them here and just have a constant fog color. If we use shallows, we sort of get this sort of a more complex set of colors that we can have for sunspots, shallows, and if we go underwater, it gets deeper and darker. And shallows boost can be used to sort of control how far the shallows sort of settings exist for. Use blur is something that we've kind of stopped using recently, but you can enable it and it will add a little bit of a blur to your objects in the distance, but it can produce some depth artifacts. For example, you could see this sort of outline over here. Now, typically the way to do this will be to increase the fog, or rather lower the fog range to remove these sort of artifacts. But again, it's something of a bit of a limiting in terms of artistic expression. So we've disabled it by default. It's there if you need it. And then you also have the blur quality, which is how many samples. Ideally, we recommend 3, but maybe 5, depending on your needs. Generally, it does bring about diminishing returns. So let's disable it right now. Next, we have waterline color, which is the color of the waterline itself. We can set this on a individual basis depending on what our water is and what we want. Next up, we have line thickness, so we can make the waterline thicker. We can also increase its height, but at the moment you might be noticing that the waterline is getting thinner again, and that is because of another setting called underwater mask height and blend. Now with these two, we can do an additional offset of the underwater effects. So for example, something like this, and we can also increase the thickness like this. And there we go. Now I have a really thick waterline effect. Next up, we have waterline blur. Now these won't do much if we don't use the blur, but this kind of does pretty much the same version of the blur, but for near the waterline. Next up, fog range and blend are kind of self-explanatory. It's how far the fog will be and how smooth the transition will be. So now we have like a really sort of murky looking water. Let's get back to our original values. Next, we have use rays that we can just outright disable if we don't need rays. Now we're going to enable them, and we have settings for like ray color. Now going red, again, red gets absorbed pretty quickly, so some color values may be just not too visible. Next up, there is ray fade, which controls the overall kind of strength of the rays. Ray height minimum and maximum, so how far down the rays will be visible. For example, if we lower the minimum, we could see that the rays will stretch all the way down into the depths, and ray max, how far up they're kind of visible. So right now we could kind of see the overall, they stretch into the infinity, which isn't too realistic. So maybe we want to increase this value, or rather lower it, and just sort of cut them off over here. And yeah. Ground truth normals, this isn't generally something we need to worry about in this case, though it will help to have them universally on. The underwater mask we already went over. The displacement, again, it's good to have these settings universal against all of your water materials. And the same goes for the shore settings again. The blueprint settings will be set by the blueprint, and we have an additional number of settings over here. So the anisotropy kind of controls the overall sun kind of breakdown and blend. We also can sharpen this up with the blend settings. Just this is kind of like for depth. Camera speed offset. Now when we move the camera, you could see that our rays move. Now if we increase this to something really high, when we move the camera, you can see that they move really fast. And if we lower it, they hardly move at all. So the default value is pretty good. Near plane, it's we already went over that. Offset kind of controls the overall blend of the anisotropy and the skylight color. So you could control it so maybe the depths are brighter than what's above, so on and so forth. Overall, the default values are really pretty well set up, so you don't really need to mess with them too much. Then you have some anisotropy for the rays themselves, so they get a little bit brighter. Then you have the sort of how harsh this transition is and the power, so they can be like really harsh. Then you have ray contrast A and B, and these basically control how harsh the rays are. This can make like the rays look extra thick. Ray depth mask, this kind of controls how visible the rays will be at a certain depth. Rather, they will fade away and become more visible as we move the camera up and down. Next, ray mask A and B controls the kind of spread of the rays themselves. So lowering it, you could see that they go all the way out into infinity. Whoops. Yeah, ray mask A and how they start, we could inverse them, so on and so forth. Ray scene depth will control how rays are, let's see, blocked by objects in terms of depth. For example, you could see that once we're near this sort of a large structure, the rays don't intersect it, but if we move far away, they do. So these values here control how this kind of works. The blending, how close they are near and far away. So for example, here we want to have something like this. And this is because all of the effects here are kind of fake volumetrics. This is what makes them really fast to render while they still look pretty good. Sun brightness, pretty much self-explanatory, controls the brightness of the hotspot where the sun would be. And then you have sun brightness depth fade, so how this will fade with depth. And then we have the offset, so the sun will stick around for longer before fading away. Next, we have ray ambient speed, which is technically two values, the red and the green here, and we can increase this more. But yeah, the default values are pretty good. So what we have initially. And next up you have the ray tiling, so you could increase the sort of density of the rays. If needed, if you're trying to simulate something like shallower water with smaller waves. So overall, these are the kind of settings for the more basic underwater effects with Waterline. In the next video, we're going to go in a bit more detail with the volumetrics and caustics, and yeah, stay tuned for more.